Alrighty, today we get to have fun. We get to talk about how our different perspectives and the intersectional mixes that make up every one of us, how those different backgrounds influence the kind of science we do. And I'm going to hand over, we have here Matteo Berglund, Emily Marie Purvis, and Denise Martinez, who are going to be our presenters today. They are all graduate students in your program, and they have been involved in workshops about this topic that have prepared them to present to a broader audience.
Today, we'll be talking about examining the practice of science. As Marcel said, I'm Matteo Berglund. I'm a third-year PhD student in the GGE. My research focuses on the impacts of anthropogenic change on aquatic systems and fish. I'm a white woman. I grew up on unceded Mechoopda tribal land in what is now Chico, California. I have what I would consider to be a pretty traditional scientific training. I studied biology as an undergraduate, and now I'm in the ecology program here at UC Davis. And I was introduced to a lot of the ideas we're talking about today through the Asking Different Programs question a couple years ago. And that program really impacted the way that I think about my work. And it was a lot of ideas that I'd never been presented with before through my ecology training. So that's why I'm here today. And we share a little bit about ourselves and where we're coming from to acknowledge that the perspective that we're bringing to this material affects the way that we experience and understand the world. And so it's relevant to know a little bit about who we are. So with that, I'll pass it over to Emily.
Hi, everyone. My name is Emily. I am a third-year PhD student in the GGE. I study the effects of climate change and settler colonialism on California's forests. I am also a white woman. I'm originally from unceded Ohlone territory in what is now Gilroy, California. And I'm really excited for the opportunity to talk to all of you today.
So we are going to start with just what we're doing today and why we're doing it so that you know what to expect. This lesson is designed to introduce ideas about how science interacts with other social structures and to encourage all of us as ecologists to reflect on the practice of science. And by the practice of science, we mean not just what we do as scientists, but how we do it. And this is important because the field of ecology is historically and currently influenced by other social structures and structures of power, but analysis about these relationships are often absent from standard ecology curriculum. So a lot of scientists aren't prepared to grapple with these ideas and think about the way that they impact their work. But awareness and reflexivity about these ideas is really valuable and can really improve the quality of our research by opening up novel questions and novel methods, and also helping us be aware of biases and assumptions that we bring into our work, and whether implicitly or explicitly. And by being aware of those and addressing them explicitly, we can improve the quality of our work and be more thoughtful about the impact that our work has in the world, and thereby hopefully reduce any harm that it might have.
So we would argue that it's inherently valuable to learn about how power and oppression affect the practice of science. These are issues of justice, ultimately, that affect all of us, especially the most marginalized in our scientific community. However, we thought we'd also highlight some additional benefits to all of you to engaging with these topics. First, understanding how science shapes and is shaped by sociocultural structures of power and oppression is central to the field of ecology. These conversations are receiving more and more attention in the literature, at conferences, within universities, and the ability to participate in them is becoming more of an essential rather than optional skill for ecologists. Additionally, big funders are increasingly looking for these themes in grant and fellowship proposals. Over the past few years, the NSF has put out several calls emphasizing programs that increase diversity, equity, and inclusion, including programs that target recruitment and retention of historically oppressed groups in STEM, as well as calls for interdisciplinary research projects that explore how social, cultural, political, and economic forces shape scientific research and the role of science in society. So the ability of scientists to reckon with this material through their research and advocacy helps make everyone more competitive applicants for programs that emphasize broader impacts. Just as a quick roadmap to what we're going to be doing today, we are going to start out with a reflection activity before diving deeper into some major themes. We're going to have a research presentation given by Denise before taking a break. And after the break, we are going to dive into the 2 case study readings that we had you all check out before class. And then we're going to end with one more reflection activity.
So we're going to start considering these reflection questions. We're going to give you a couple of minutes to reflect on them individually, and then we're going to do a 4-minute breakout room for you to share with classmates and talk about these ideas together. And you don't have to get to all of the questions, and you don't have to consider them in order. Just pick maybe 1 or 2 that are interesting to you today. The questions are: what is science and who defines it? What are different ways that we gather knowledge, and how do we share and/or guard knowledge? What makes research ethical? And lastly, have you ever been asked to reflect on questions like these before? And why or why not do you think that might be the case?
Yeah, thank you all for engaging in our interactive session. We are going to dive a little bit deeper into these topics now. First, we want to talk about the co-constitutive relationship between science and structures of power and oppression. So science is shaped by racism, sexism, settler colonialism, and other structures of power and oppression. And simultaneously, science reinforces these social structures. I want to elaborate a little on settler colonialism, just in case you're not familiar with the term. It's not always discussed in academic settings, so don't worry if you don't know that much about it. Settler colonialism just describes the phenomenon in which colonizers discover a place that's already inhabited by indigenous peoples and then attempt to settle there permanently. So, for example, the United States is a settler colonial nation. If you want to read more about settler colonialism, Mattea is going to drop some links in the chat to introductory papers that I personally really like. But back to the broader idea of the reciprocal relationship between science and social structures of power and oppression. There are a lot of different ways that this impacts science. And we just wanted to highlight a couple of these different categories. The first is impacts on researchers' experiences of identity and belonging, especially the experience of individuals with marginalized identities in science. So, for example, in ecology fieldwork, a hyper-masculine environment can discriminate against women or put us in danger. Additionally, racial and ethnic minorities, especially Black and Indigenous people, are at increased risk of racialized violence in the field. There have been really great papers written about fieldwork risks over the past couple of years, and Mattea is going to drop some more resources in the chat if you want to check them out. Another category that this theme impacts is the very research questions that we're able to ask and answer. For example, because dominant science reflects settler colonial ways of producing knowledge, indigenous ways of knowing or understanding the world are not considered legitimate or evidence-based. And even when traditional ecological knowledge has been incorporated into ecology, it's often in the context of dominant science being used to validate what Indigenous people already know, which only reinforces the idea that Indigenous knowledge isn't legitimate because we still need the scientific method to prove their knowledge as being real or true. So settler colonialism promotes the belief that we can't ask and answer scientific questions through Indigenous worldviews, only the Western dominant scientific method. So this is an example of how science is shaped by the structures of power and oppression, because settler colonial invalidation of Indigenous ways of knowing only allows us to ask and answer certain kinds of scientific questions. there are also a lot of examples of how science actually reinforces these structures and perpetuates them in our society. In my field of forest ecology, science has been used to justify conservation and restoration goals and aesthetics that are very Western European and deny the historical value and impact of Indigenous management strategies. For example, there's been a lot of science about how we need to appropriately thin mountain forests by timber harvesting rather than burning. And all of this just contributes to the erasure and elimination of Native people from their landscapes and from our society. I'll also say that these are issues that I've personally really grappled with. It's really hard to reconcile people's good intentions and well-meaning research motivations with structures of power that we are all working within and potentially contributing to. I know for myself personally, I've had the opportunity in my career to work for all sorts of brilliant and kind-hearted ecologists, conservation and restoration specialists, land and resource managers who are all genuinely trying to create a better world, even though they might not realize how power and oppression are entangled in their work. And our goal here today is just to help encourage awareness of these issues so we can all better understand and take account of them, not to like call anyone out or like say anyone is bad.
So the next core theme that we want to talk about is the idea of value neutrality. And science is often considered and talked about as value neutral, meaning that it's free from bias and separate both from larger social systems and from individual researchers' perspectives. But the research that we pursue is actually shaped by social, political, and economic values, and it has value-laden implications. So I find value in the way that Dr. Max Liboiron talks about this. They state, as soon as you choose to ask one research question, you're choosing not to ask other ones. That's not inherently good or bad, but you do start to align yourself with some things and not others. And I find this framework really helpful. And again, the point is not that some of these decisions are good or bad, but that it's important to acknowledge all of the forces that shape our work and the fact that our work doesn't happen in isolation from other systems. And this relates to another core idea, which is power. And again, I draw on the words of Dr. Liboiron, who describes power as the way that some things seem natural and normal, even inevitable, and carry on easily, versus things that are very hard to do, that don't make much sense, that don't tend to happen. The same thing happens when we're making scientific decisions. Certain research questions get asked a lot, certain ones don't. Certain kinds of people get worked with a lot, certain kinds of people don't. Power is more like infrastructure, not decisions or behavior. And I find this framework really helpful, this idea of power as infrastructure, and thinking about ways that existing structures in which we do our work, such as the university, how do these existing structures create paths of greater and less resistance? And how do those paths of more and less resistance influence what type of work gets done? It's easier to get funding for certain questions or to have access to the resources to answer certain questions than others. And how does that over the long term sort of shape and steer our research agenda as a field? I think funding is one helpful example of an infrastructure of power that shapes research agendas. So big funding agencies like NSF or the Department of Defense, their research priorities have a huge influence on the kind of work that we can do because we need money to carry out our research. And so the research that we do is affected by what we can get funding for. And I think this is an important theme to introduce because as scientists, I think we're often not taught to recognize our positions and our control over the research process as a form of power. But it is the fact that we get to ask questions and the questions that we ask are considered important is a form of power.
We next want to talk about the concept of intersectionality, which was originally coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, a law professor at UCLA and Columbia. She created this term to capture how Black women experience the intersection of racism and sexism in a unique way than people just experiencing one or the other. Intersectionality is a framework for investigating how different axes of oppression interact with each other to produce unique experiences and opportunities based on intersecting identities. And our intersectional identities really affect our opportunities and sense of belonging in science. So for example, over the past few decades, there's been a tremendous push to get more women in science, which has been super successful in ecology, which is really great. If you go to the GGE website and you see the list of all the student names, there's tons of women in our program. And this really reflects, I think, the broader field too. But I also noticed that a lot of these newer recruits and early career ecologists are white women, which isn't a bad thing, but it still means that Black women, Indigenous women, and other women of color are still underrepresented. And we can use an intersectionality framework to think about why this might be. And in this scenario, because white women benefit from white supremacy, they're affected differently by this push to get more women in ecology than other women who have multiply marginalized identities that affect them in different ways, who are experiencing the compounding effects of racism and sexism. Obviously, this example is really simplistic. There's way more axes of identity than just race and gender, and this example totally doesn't capture the complexity of how this is actually playing out in the real world, but hopefully gives you an idea of a tangible example of how the concept of intersectionality can be applied to look at the field of ecology. So now that we've introduced some of these major themes that touch on really problematic concepts, we wanted to introduce one possible response, which is justice-oriented research. So like Mattea was talking about earlier, we know that science isn't value neutral, and justice-oriented research is just a way to place a value at the forefront in considering research questions and methodologies. This involves asking or taking into account why we want to know the answers to various questions, who the research is benefiting and who it might be disadvantaging, who's involved in the research, and how various roles may be stratified by race, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, etc. There are a lot of justice-oriented methodologies, and a lot of them actually draw from the humanities and social science fields, but can be applied really well to science too. We wanted to highlight a couple. First is community-based participatory research and participatory action research. These are both research methodologies that pursue action or change and research or understanding at the same time. They're a little bit different from each other, but they both involve community members as equal partners in defining valuable research questions, collecting data, and integrating findings in beneficial social change. The next is feminist approaches to research, defined by the Feminist Research Institute at UC Davis as improving objective outcomes and community benefits through incorporating multiple perspectives into each stage of the research design process. So just really thinking through kind of who your research is for and why you're pursuing certain questions. There's also been a lot written over the past couple decades about specifically feminist approaches to science. It can be challenging to conceptualize how to incorporate justice in ecology research. There are a lot of good examples. We're running a little bit short on time, so I'm not going to dive into them, but we're going to put this PowerPoint slide on Canvas so you can all check it out later. And importantly, Mattea and I really wanted to hammer home this idea that it's possible to pursue justice-oriented research at any stage of your career, even in grad school, and to highlight amazing work done by people in our GGE community. And that is why we invited Denise to talk about her research.
So hi, everyone. It's so good to be here with you today. My name is Denise Martinez. Like was mentioned, I'm a PhD candidate in the GGE. I'm in year 5, and it tends to happen that 5th years kind of like disappear into their dissertation. And so it's just really good to be here with y'all today. And, you know, during COVID, it's been hard to meet folks in the newer cohort. So I'm really looking forward to learning with you all today. So a little bit more about me. So I'm a descendant of Tutunacu and Mexica people, which are indigenous groups from Veracruz, Mexico, and Tenochtitlan, Mexico, respectively. I'm a first-generation immigrant. I moved to the US when I was 5, and I grew up in Shasta ancestral territory and kind of near Kaduk housing and services. And so that's Siskiyou County today. And I'm, you know, a first-generation college student as well. I have now done 2 degrees at UC Davis. I did my undergrad here and continued for my master's, and now I'm doing my PhD. So if you need restaurant recommendations, I'm your girl. But for our time today, you know, we'll start actually with a short reflection that'll help ground us in the topic of cultural burning, which is what I'll be talking with you all a bit about today, in addition to just community-based research, like Emery was saying. I'll share a bit about what I've learned from folks like Ron Good, pictured here, and many others. And I'll just end with my reflections on community-based research and kind of what I've learned as a community-based scholar as best practices, and also kind of areas where you can make it a little bit more practical for yourself as a graduate student. So yeah, so before we begin, I thought it might be important to think about fire itself. How has fire impacted your life? What is your relationship with fire? I like asking this question because I really think that these reflections are important. You know, many of us have, you know, really positive associations with fire, a really good relationship with fire. Some of us have evolving relationships. But also, you know, many of us might have traumatic or negative experiences with fire. You know, California has had some really devastating wildfires. And chances are, if you've lived in California or the West for a long time, you've been impacted or know someone that has been impacted. But at the same time, when we think about our associations with fire as a relationship, it helps us see and understand our emotional reactions, as well as think about where we might be able to improve that relationship. What are the reciprocal ways that we can engage with fire that could improve our relationship? So I actually grew up in a place with a lot of negative fire impacts from, you know, evacuations. My dad was a farm worker, was expected to work and smoke. And so one of the ways I really healed my negative association with fire was through participating in cultural burning and learning from the leadership of California Native leaders. And so for those of you not familiar with cultural burning, some key high-level points are that fire is essential to ecosystem function in California forests. Obviously, that is a very broad statement, but we're going to stay at a high level here. You know, and I may also be preaching to the choir. There's probably a lot of forest and fire folks in the room, but a part of the reason those big fires occur is because of the many years absence of active forest stewardship. So Indigenous people were and continue to be experts at this. And through careful caretaking, Indigenous-led fire reduced fuels in forests that led to, you know, the wildfires that we see now that are really high intensity and destructive. But it wasn't just, you know, managing fuels that led California Native people to burn. Fire was essential for almost every aspect of Indigenous life. And so, you know, fire is so essential that many California Native people, specifically here thinking about Karuk and Yurok people, view their cultures as fire dependent. So fire has been used to maintain key food and basketry staples, as well as wildlife habitat for elk and salmon. Fire therefore uplifts Indigenous food and cultural sovereignty and ensures the well-being of California Native communities as a whole. And so whenever I kind of provide a list of practices, I like to throw in the caveat that this list is obviously not exhaustive of all the uses of fire. And in fact, like each practice and use is informed by a broader set of cultural values, cultural institutions, knowledge systems. And so you're kind of seeing that the point of a practice that's like informed by this super broad and deeply embedded system of institutions, etc. And so these practices can't actually be divorced from that context. And so it's not just the practices, it's the cultural institutions that put these practices forward. But I think, again, a list of practices helps us all visualize the material manifestation of Indigenous knowledge. It helps us see it in the forest, and it helps us kind of visualize it better. So Emery actually did a great job of this in the presentation, but just settler colonialism, disrupted these Indigenous practices in California by making fire illegal and actively suppressing it, using command and control approach to natural resource management that began in the early 19th century. Native people continued to practice cultural burning to the frustration of settlers that actually used this as an excuse to instigate violence against California Native communities. So fire suppression, we often think about as kind of like a scientific or management approach, but it actually has taken the form of violence, like shooting Native people, starting cultural burns like on site. It's been harassment and arrest. And it has also taken the form of what environmental justice scholars call slow violence, like the loss of native plants and cultural species, as well as a loss of safe forest conditions that has led to cultural suppression and large wildfires of today that endanger not just native communities, but everyone. So slow violence is, again, a term from environmental justice, and it refers to actions that create violence over time. So like pollution in people's bodies, or in this case, like losing cultural and healthy foods to fire suppression. So these are slow, quote unquote, in that it doesn't harm someone immediately, perhaps, but causes increased risk for health and well-being over time. So, this is why folks like Dr. Frank Lake, who is Kaduk and Yurok cultural practitioner, have framed cultural burning as a spiritual obligation and also an act of political defiance in the context of governmental oppression and regulation. So this is a picture of Frank and his son. Okay, so see comment in the chat. I can see the chat, but it might be hard for me to engage with it. There's just too many screens going on right now, but definitely if you want to unmute yourself, feel free. So given this context and kind of learning about it in undergrad and early graduate school, I knew that being a researcher in this space would require a kind of different approach. And I think it's important that we all consider our positionality as researchers at a university that has stolen knowledge. It has stolen folks, their bodies out of graves. The university holds these items and other cultural patrimony from Indigenous people to this day. So in any work done with Indigenous people, it is essential that we prioritize knowledge sovereignty so as to not continue those abuses. And knowledge sovereignty is really the ability to make sovereign decisions about your community knowledge. In collaborations, this might look like data sharing agreements with tribes or broader community members, giving community members the ability to interpret and disseminate knowledge in a culturally appropriate way. It also includes the ability to create new knowledge by continuing to practice cultural stewardship like cultural burning, because by practicing, new knowledge comes about. So knowledge sovereignty is important for understanding past abuses, understanding what abuses are ongoing and what we can do to support efforts to remediate that. And also, how we can support efforts to return cultural stewardship for the creation of future knowledge. So community-based participatory research is an approach to research that is all about bringing in community voices and respecting knowledge sovereignty. It attempts to challenge the hierarchies of knowledge by including non-academic partners in research process as legitimate experts and collaborators. So these non-academic partners are often people that have lived experience with the phenomenon being studied. So this can look like communities informing researchers about potential sites of toxic exposure, or like Indigenous communities working with watershed scientists to understand environmental changes and possible management solutions. Another important thing to note about CBPR, or community-based participatory research, is that it exists on a spectrum, and a researcher's role in that collaboration can look really different depending on where on the spectrum you are. Some communities want to be a part of every aspect of research, and I think it's really important to be open to that. But more often than not, people are working with you on research because they care, but they're not necessarily getting paid for those hours and have other responsibilities. So if you're interested in this kind of work, I always advise that you have a conversation with your community partners about, what parts of the research process they feel strongly that they should be a part of. And I think when people think of CBPR, they think like, I need to maximize collaboration, I need to work on community on every aspect, and that's what makes a good CBPR project. But I actually think it's about maximizing accountability. So building enough trust where community members and researchers can come together and offer the best of each of their skill sets, and also so no one feels overextended. So central to accountability is relationship building. So if you don't have relationships with the people you work with, they're unlikely to hold you accountable or even just trust you in the first place. And this makes, initial contact or relationship building extra important. And I think relationship building is something that folks kind of just say without giving you a kind of guide of what you could do. So as a graduate student, one way you could do this is to actually do a cold call and reach out to community stakeholders you're interested in working with. And the best way to do this is to actually bring them an idea that kind of builds on a project they might already be working on or something you think would be relevant to them. And this is a long-term idea. So if this would be best if you're working on a PhD or another long-term research project. So the second thing is you could join an already established partnership by looking for an advisor or supervisor that does community-based participatory research. You could be co-advised if you already have an awesome advisor. And this is perhaps the most useful for folks that want to, finish their project faster. And, you could plug into a project and kind of build out a thesis or a dissertation based on like a subset of something that's already ongoing and established. And third, and this is the most variable, a lot of us come from communities that are experiencing environmental problems of one kind or another. And thinking about the problems in your community and building a trusted group of people to work on those projects together can be really rewarding. And working, as an insider has a lot of benefits. You might have a lot of experience already. You might have the connections. I think just something to consider, and it's not good or bad, is that sometimes your community might have higher expectations of you. And this might actually be a benefit, but it's just something to know before you go in so that it doesn't surprise you. However you decide to start this partnership, make sure that you continue to show up and be accessible so that people can talk to you and ask questions. And there are really multiple accountability mechanisms that you can build into your research, and we'll be reviewing a little bit of those next, but really it'll be variable based on your context. So what does accountability look like in research? The first is that consent is construed by the institutional review board at the university that ensures that folks are engaging in an ethical way. And there's a lot of, that kind of university bureaucracy that I think is important, but maybe incomplete. Do communities and individuals consent to the way you plan on collecting, sharing data, or otherwise engaging on people's homelands? Are you following correct protocols for engaging elders, or even engaging wildlife and plants in a culturally appropriate way? So those are all questions to ask. Along with this, are you having conversations about setting up, data sharing? Where will the data go? Where will it be stored? And will community be allowed to use it for future research? And one way that I've something I found helpful is a community research board. And folks either serve as a point of contact and can advise you on day-to-day things. Community should always understand how you're collecting data and broadly what your analysis means. It's great if people want to be involved, but really, if they don't understand what you're doing, that they can't consent adequately and they can't help you as well. And so it's a great exercise for science communication. And last, co-authoring or even copyright may be appropriate in cases where community members have contributed significantly to the research. And so after research, accountability looks like staying connected and making sure that you wrap things up. This looks like ensuring that community research products are completed. So not just that really great paper in Nature, but also the pamphlet for the community office. And, this can look like a lot of that sort of product. It could also look at policy memos, look like mentorship for students and professionals. It's like mostly just about staying in contact with folks. You got a master's degree out of this, and that's awesome, or you got a PhD out of this, but continuing to be of service is a reciprocal way to engage. So if you decide to pursue collaboration with Indigenous people, please keep in mind all of these extra considerations about ethical research and really just any community. It's important to consider these, and I'm always down to brainstorm with someone if they would like. And so with that, my 15-minute whirlwind of is over. And if anyone has questions, you can reach out, or I don't know if we have time for questions, but you could always reach out to my email.